it is important to know that the half of my life happened before the system change. So before the freedom of society.
So I spent my youth in a country that was called Soviet Union. And we know it was what kind of system it was, ideological restrictions and this state-sponsored atheism. Religion was something that was very distant and far away.
I grew up in a communist country, and in a country where we were not even sure that something like religion existed. Meaning that we were taught that religion was a thing of the past, and I remember that as a child I always thought that churches were simply historical monuments.
I'm a product of Soviet Union, and we were first in our universities to study scientific atheism. We were students. They tried to indoctrinate.
Doing history of religions, generalist and comparative and very specific history of religions, doing your work and having your life, perhaps quasi all your life, involved in doing scholarship on religion in Romania means that you remember easily that episode which happened some 33 years ago when a communist dictatorship has eventually fallen. All kind of unfreedom, of non-freedom, of anti-freedom was present in my native country.
I was given an offer by the professor of the chair of scientific atheism. He called me and said, "Oh, you are such a good student. Maybe you want to participate in a scientific project. You should go, maybe it's Christmas time, you should go to some churches in Riga. Just write down what they are speaking there and how many young people are there. Do you know somebody? Are there many students? Maybe you can get some personal information for them and so on. And just refer me and you will be free from exams."
Church, I mean Catholic Church, dominant religious denomination in Lithuania, was persecuted by the Soviet authorities who had just so-called critical atheism. Certainly it has nothing to do with religious studies. It was a kind of propaganda or deconstruction of religious studies, I would say.
Sociologists of religion who worked during the Soviet period, of course, their main task was to investigate how religion is disappearing from the consciousness of Soviet people and to demonstrate that the Soviet man, Советский человек, is going to be built in the near future.
I wonder how people, scholars, continue to stand like on one leg without losing what I feel to be, or would call me maybe their balance, or they're trying to be in balance.
During the Soviet time, Catholic Church was not only dominant religious movement, but also a kind of center for anti-Soviet resistance. To be a member of Catholic Church actually at the same time indicated that you are somehow more or less anti-Soviet oriented.
I think the interest in religion, it represents some kind of alternative knowledge that I became aware of. I remember one of the first religious texts that I read very attentively was Dhammapada from the Buddhist Pali canon that was translated by my later teacher Linnart Mäll. And it was some kind of liberating effect to read this ancient text that seemed so fresh, it has so much social criticism against the official authorities like the Brahmins. So the Brahmin figure in this Dhammapada, it somehow reminded me of some kind of communist authorities who are preaching their doctrine that nobody had that faith in.
Then came Solidarity, and I was engaged. As a teenager, I was engaged in the Solidarity, so in this great movement towards freedom. And I was in prison as a teenager, and then I chose the Catholic University in Lublin. It was not because I was a Catholic or enthusiastic Catholic, but because the Catholic University in Lublin in that time was perceived as the seed of freedom, as the lonely university between East Germany and the end of Soviet Russia, in which the Marxism was not a part of the program.
I studied in university scientific catechism, and that as well contributed to my interest in religion. This study course in scientific catechism arose protest in each of students not to deny the value of religion, but to be interested in religions.
I believe, I'm not sure how to say that.
If you indeed indulge in knowing more about the construction of scholarly commitments within dictatorships, you may easily find that beyond official censorship, it is the private censorship. Scholars, writers of all kinds, this is something very similar to autocolonialism. They became somehow even more proficient in censoring themselves than the authorities.
Do you want to collaborate and submit your research results to be used by ideologists? Or, like it was in Soviet period, you have to leave academic research.
Greatest mentor at the university when I studied philosophy was György Bence, a great philosopher who actually was banned for almost 20 years under communism. So he did not make this compromise, you know. So he lived on translating books during his best years, you know, from 30 to 50 or something like it, you know, and it was only possible for him to return to philosophy after 1990, when he actually became leader of the institute and so on. Although you realized that sometimes you had to make your compromise, it was still the best example that, well, perhaps you can survive without making compromises as well. And you cannot even say that you had an unsuccessful life.
Thinking of scholars like Lukko Masing, he was a professor of theology of Old Testament in the 1930s at the University of Tartu, and he lived in Tartu. Well, he lost his academic position at the university, but he kept writing on different kind of religions, and I don't think that there was any kind of self-censorship, or it is he knew there is no way to get published. But in small circles, it was possible to discuss this scholarship, and it was also my vision of a future. I didn't think that I could write books and publish books on religions. It's perhaps also writing some manuscript works that are maybe spread well, copied by type writers. So I don't think that well, ideological constraints or some kind of official censorship actually limits research of freedom so much.
It's not possible to erase freedom from people's life. The freedom exists in private sphere. And it was typical for Czech that they closed themselves in some specific private world, which was constructed by their family, by their friends. And in this bubble, we can say, the freedom existed.
Minden rendben! Minden rendben!
But I remember how during the last years of communism, there was already what Václav Havel and others call post-totalitarian regimes, meaning that not even those who ruled the system believed in it anymore. When you got banned in the 1980s, it was or censored. It was like the censor himself or herself usually apologized for it.
In the beginning of the 1980s, exactly 1981, I started in this flat, a kind of so-called, how to say, community building building a society of friends to celebrate our 1848 revolution. Petőfi, the great Hungarian poet, and the freedom fight against the Russians. The Russians crushed that revolution. But to celebrate this during the 70s, 80s, it was not allowed. So this kind of small play against the system, I mean the communist system, we played here. However, of course, we saw a car outside, stopping on the street, and with some people smoking, and watching who is coming here. But nothing has happened really, and I didn't care who are watching us. No, nothing has happened.
My research were very much focused on the methodology, on the attitudes, and as such, they did not really come in the focus of attention of the censorship. So I've never been asked to remove my publication, nor asked not to conduct actually research and publish them. On my experience, looking on my experience, I wouldn't be able to name any significant factors. I'd never witnessed this sort of event.
You know, this transformation started in 1989, and I was 14 back then, which means, I was at the age when you develop the sense of who you are, you seek for inspirations from the circle of friends. I was very much open to new experience, and also I wanted to somehow question what my parents represented and the older generations, right? So, yeah, and my parents, and back then they were Roman Catholics. In many countries of Central and Eastern Europe, under the communist regime, religion was severely repressed. This doesn't apply to Poland so much.
The most radical change was the political upheaval and then the aftermath of the Romanian Revolution of December 1989. I belong to a generation which tried faire flèche de toute bois to obtain every single possible argument in doing this type of research while corresponding to a historical moment. Our chance was actually that moment of obtaining radical, confusing, perplexing, understandably perplexing, very generous and very enigmatic type of freedom.
The system change brought for me freedom, and I started to work in the former department for Marxist and Leninist studies. And I started to teach, and the head of the department was a former party secretary of the Communist Party. a good man. And after some month of my teaching activity, he invited me in his room or office and asked me the question, do you know why I have to taken you into the department? I answered, okay, I think because of my good PhD from Vienna, or because of my high-level German capacity, or because students love me. He said, no, you are the reprinting of the Institute shield. At the former time, it was written before of my office on the wall, Marxist-Leninist department, and now you are the repainting line because you are a Catholic. And with you we can argue and demonstrate we are no more the former stupid Marxist. We are open.
When I applied for an OTKA support, OTKA is the Hungarian National Foundation for Research. It was about religious change in Hungary. I could conduct my research without any influence from outside, and I could publish my results, even if the results were not always very favorable, for instance, for my church. The end result is that there is secularization, and there is a decline between generations concerning different types of religiosity. But I was never asked to change my wording or not to write something. I think if there is a problem, then the problem is that what you are researching about, what you are writing about, is not necessarily read by, for instance, church representatives who could maybe use it.
The question is how society will treat our knowledge. In postmodernist societies or postmodernistic societies, when we are dealing with different truths, which we don't consider one truth as the final and absolute truth, this is tricky to persuade people that science is one and the best authority which can produce only knowledge.
The years we have moved from 0 point to what we have now, academic studies of religion. So situation has changed tremendously, but in sense of freedom, I would not be so sure, not be so certain, telling that we have complete freedom of religious studies.
My question is there still a question about the freedom of the academy? Or freedom itself matters no more? Because we are no more persecuted. Scientific approach is no more interesting. It is marginalized. It is like the make-up. as the system change happened, 1989, then it was very surprising for all of us that religion came into the public discourse of the Hungarian society. Some political parties, some politicians, some people of the culture started to speak about Christianity, about Christian Hungary, Christian Europe, and they argued that a Christian religion could be the new fundament of the Hungarian society after the atheistic, materialistic, communistic system. It was very interesting, but at the same time it was for me a little bit suspect.
Next, everything changed, and we began new life. And it is also paradoxical because the old seed or space for freedom, church, became to be perceived as a source of repression.
After the fall of communism, the Marxist current in sociology of religion has been delegitimized. And this was related, of course, to, the all-encompassing delegitimization of anything related to the communist ideology. In turn, the confessional current has survived and is doing quite well now.
Especially in Lithuania, impact of Catholic Church and authorities of Catholic Church is evident in many fields, starting from particular instructions given for some politicians and political groups on the parliament level, again dealing with groups of scholars who are close to the church, scholars working at university. Essentially, I would say that we may speak about particular gangs of scholars.
The country where I'm coming from and the whole region have not experienced the second wave feminism. At one point, after the Soviet Union, the collapse of Soviet Union, they were returning to the more kind of traditional way of living instead of the gender equality which was embedded on them from the Soviet authorities. The dominant Roman Catholicism is certainly not the best probably religion to help women to reach the leadership.
In academia, women are quite exposed to difficult position when they like to combine research and family life. We are talking about restrictions of women who like to pursue academic career, being a woman and being full-fledged mothers and wives. And that's, I would say, in academia, it's stronger than ever.
I have this passion of making research, of studying something. And as I'm a family person, for me it's always a question about balancing between family and academic career and how to make good things, let's say, in research and how to stay a good mother for children. I'm participating in conferences already for more than 15 years, and I can say that there was only one international conference in Tartu that provided kindergarten. So perhaps this also would be a great thing in contributing to the freedom of research.
My experience is a narrowing of academic freedom. There are more burdens of academic freedom now than 10 or 20 years ago. This is my experience, and this is mainly based on well-known cases. It's not about research on religion, but it's about who decides that the major on gender studies is not allowed at state universities. What are the grounds for expelling Central European University from the country? But I would also consider, as part of this process, new general structure of the state-run or formerly state-run higher education institutions in Hungary, which are now the vast majority of them belong to foundations. Not the state runs that universities anymore, but foundations. And this is one point that actually was also thematized by the European Commission when they asked for some changes, and they asked that political members should not be part of this board of the foundations.
I really got worried about this freedom during the past few years, and not mainly because of governments or authorities, but because of this political polarization of the whole public sphere. It can be even a heroic thing, when you oppose the powers that be. But it is never so heroic when you oppose public opinion.
Choosing a different methodological or theoretical angle is not only seen as an unpopular move in many quarters, it can become risky for one's career. By now we know how far this can go, don't we? Paradigm shifts can claim their victims, as discordant or dissident voices are very easily amplified and distorted in the age of the internet. The way how this trend may impact freedom of research is rather manifest, isn't it?
You have to be very flexible as a researcher, and flexible not in a very positive sense. By flexible, I mean you have to change the topic from one project to the other project. For example, if you are working for 3 years on political activism of young people, and next 4 years you are involved in the project which is dedicated to cultural heritage, and later came the project where you have to make research on fundamentalism and radicalism. These are main difficulties I met in my researcher's life, because I have no time to investigate some problem in depth. I have to move from one topic to another topic in 3-4 years because of social demand, and of course the social demand is regulated by politicians.
In Soviet time there were polders everywhere and dogmas everywhere, in Soviet sense of course. But surprisingly it somehow made people to feel themselves free, and actually if we are able to orientate, then we can feel free ourselves at one moment. But today, in this very postmodern setting, and where very seemingly there are not too much limits and things like that, people and young people especially tend to lose themselves. The freedom is very absolute, but
in the early 2000s, we really weren't afraid. We couldn't even imagine what we should be afraid of.
For me, the question about the academic freedom is a real question. It is crucial and central for my life story. But I am not really sure whether the next generation has still this question.
I believe, I'm not sure how to say that.
Dangerous tendency is the rise of political populism, which creates the area where religious and political leaders can find academic study of religion as a kind of dangerous area in need of certain restrictions. And I believe that with this increase of political populism, academic study of religion might be endangered.
This is a war, the Russian-Ukrainian war. About 8 years we try to opposite of these enemies, this not Ukrainian civilization, very different civilization, on the basis of Putin's regime, on the basis of their theory of Russian world, Russian mir. So our researchers, unfortunately, have to move, to leave Ukraine, and now many of our researchers are out of Ukraine.
We know from Syria, we know from Afghanistan, we know from certain places in Central America, and also we know today, with all the gravity which this situation imposes on us all, that within the Ukrainian religious landscape, there is an inter-Christian, infra-Christian, harsh and lethal polemic between that Putin orthodoxy of Kirill, of Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, and the religious authority of Ukraine. Doing in all these countries nowadays, doing history of religions, academic study of religions, religious studies even, it is almost impossible.
One of the hot topics in Ukrainian society is the status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which before 2022 was a part of Russian Orthodox Church, and its current status is discussed. I won't tell all nuances of the discussion, but some people in Ukraine would like to ban this church because it is one of the centers of spreading of Russian world ideology. Those who claim that the ban cannot be implemented because of the right of freedom of religion are labeled as pro-Russian agents or agents of FSB. Another hot discussion in Ukrainian academia is whether we should prohibit referring to or using Russian sources in the syllabuses or research papers. And while there is no official governmental decision or law on that issue, some universities and research institutes have already decided that their faculty and research scientists should not use Russian books or academic articles in their work. And from my point of view, this is a harmful effect on academic freedom.
I can tell you frankly that freedom is a quite tricky term and quite culturally dependent. So in different cultures, the extended meaning or domain which freedom covers is really different.
Freedom of research, if there is such a thing, although I don't think that that freedom is something binary. I don't really think of freedom of research as an ideal, or of anything as an ideal.
We are trying to build the democratic system, but you know it's a not-lasting process. So our first president, Tomáš Masaryk, said, "Oh, now we would have democracy, but without any Democrats. So we have a system, but Democrats we should become."
If religion declines, it is not always a conscious process, a result of external forces who want church and religion to decline. This is not easy to understand, because there were 40 years of atheist socialist ideology ruling this country, which has exactly this goal, to eliminate religion and to eliminate churches. So I can fully understand this position of representatives of the church have, but not only the persecution of religion has led to declining religious numbers in Central and Eastern Europe, in former communist lands.
If you are researching religious attitudes which are not so much in agreement with the political power, you might be in trouble. For example, I'm meeting sometimes scholars of religion who have to run from their countries because they took very much atheistic standpoint, and Islamic countries do not accept that.
I think that at least in the Czech Republic, the freedom of research in or on the field of religious studies will be guaranteed in next decades, I guess. But I'm not sure that in a global sense the same will be, because I know some problems of my colleagues in such countries like Russia, even like United States. There is very visible and a strong pressure from some public stakeholders, not only politicians, but we can say the public activists, to influence religious studies by some concrete ideology. And most of them rooted in some religious systems. So globally, I'm not so optimistic like regionally. But I think that the science is so strong, and I'm optimistic that the science will be very successful in solving these problems.
When I think about topics such as scholarship on Tantra and Tantric tradition, Tantra in South Asia, in India, in small circles, and anthropological work that can be done, that maybe needs an initiation, a diksha from a Tantric guru. It is some kind of esoteric traditions that are there that include secrecy. And there are fields in the study of religion where secrecy is very important. And certainly the sense of responsibility that comes together with this knowledge and the inability, or it is impossibility to share some knowledge, it is there. So definitely there are scholars of religion who know much more than they are able to, then they have this freedom to include in the scholarship.
If we talk about confrontation between freedom of religion and freedom of academic studies, we should take into account that science is always immoral somehow.
Science is, how to say, it's a big business actually, and there are lots of trends and huge examples and big names and everything like that. So maybe surprisingly, those restrictions may begin also from this side, that some scholars just to copy a method or the ideas of someone else, and it's nothing about freedom then. The freedom begins from yourself, somewhere inside.
Once I was in China, in myself I felt I really should like to meet a shaman. But please be calm. And maybe I shall overcome because of my self-restraint. So I limited my freedom, telling immediately that I want to meet a shaman. No, I just smiled. And that worked. The diplomacy of smiling, I suppose, sometimes makes better result than harsh talk. And this is democracy, which only I represent. Look, the Russians tried to persuade us that what is communism, what is socialism. And we were a kind of smile. I mean, Hungary, as of course we had our hard-line communist, but we were smiling. So freedom is, you see, always have some limits and always have some unlimited version of how to transgress boundaries.